Returning to Canada after midnight tonight, prepare to self-isolate for 14 days or else face some penalties. The federal government imposed the rule today through Canada's Quarantine Act. Essential workers are excluded. Is the emergency measure appropriate? What else should the government do to flatten the curve of COVID-19? Andrew Scheer is the leader of the Conservative Party. He joins us now from the House of Commons right here in Ottawa. Hi, Mr. Scheer. Good to have you back. Thanks for your time.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me back.
I do want to ask you, of course, about the emergency aid measures and what happened in the House of Commons last night. But let me start off with the Quarantine Act. Was it the right thing for the government to do?
Well, it's a little bit late. There were many calling for these provisions to be enacted much earlier. And again, it's another example of this government reacting very slowly to things. We called for the government to restrict travel from international destinations well before they actually did. In the early days of this crisis, they said that that would be ineffective. We now know that's not true. And now they're enacting these new measures, while at the same time, many travelers don't know what to do when they land here. So they've delayed implementing this. They go into effect midnight tonight, and yet we still understand that there's no plan in place for travelers who have to land at one airport and then perhaps drive a long distance, for example, landing in Toronto and then having to get to Windsor or another community like that. So we're a little bit frustrated that there doesn't seem to be the details, even though they took so long to enact these measures.
When it comes to, for example, the case that you just laid out, someone that's landing in Toronto and has to go to Windsor. I asked Minister Qualtrough about that, and it does seem like there isn't sort of a very straightforward answer to that the situation might change, I guess, depending on which airport or if you have symptoms and that kind of thing. It looks like those details have yet to be worked out. What do you think should happen? Should there be, for example, should the government be providing accommodation for those people? Should there be a way to isolate them right away rather than make that drive to Windsor? What do you think?
Well, these are very important questions and something that we would have assumed they were working out while they were delaying imposing these measures. I suppose there's a number of options you could look at in terms of trying to find methods of travel that might be safe for people to use to protect drivers of different vehicles. That's one option. Putting people up in hotels is another. But when we're talking about 14 days to have people in those types of positions, that's going to be a big challenge both for the individuals and for the government response. There are a lot of people who were overseas when this crisis hit who tried to come home when they were told to. I've got lots of stories of constituents who are on hold with airlines for hours and hours, and so many of these people have just been caught out in these when these new directives go into place. That's why we do believe that there should be some type of accommodation made for those people facing those challenges.
So you do think that there should be accommodation if people come back?
Well, at least something to help them get through the first few hours or few days. Some type of mechanism to take that into account, and whether or not that's something that individuals can share in the responsibility of that. Those are things that we believe. Again, the government should have looked at that. They say details to come. Well, that's fine, but except that it's at midnight tonight that the new provisions come into place. So it would have been much better to have the information provided at the same time as they're announcing these measures coming into effect.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second on the timing of the Quarantine Act in general. My guess is, or maybe not my guess, but you would assume that the government didn't act right away because they were hopeful that Canadians would comply with the message that provincial leaders and federal leaders have disseminated for the last week, which is if you do come back, you better self-isolate. Would it be understandable to a degree that the government would hesitate to impose legal penalties on people, just given the sort of severity of that?
Well, if the severity of the virus is such that it can be transmitted so quickly, then I do believe it was appropriate to enact these much earlier. Again, we called on them to close the border. The government said they didn't need to. A short time later, they had to reverse their position. Remember, the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers were saying restricting travel was not effective. So to date, their handling of things has been quite slow. It seems like they're always following what other countries are doing or have already done, instead of implementing measures that other countries model their response after.
I mean, they have argued, and I do want to move on to the financial stuff, but they have argued that they're basing those decisions on the advice of public health officials, right? Not that we've asked those questions of them as well, but they've said, things change and therefore our response will change as well.
Well, they are the ones that are held responsible. They are the government, they are ministers, they are tasked with making decisions. And if, as is the case, the spread of this virus is much easier when people are coming back from overseas, when we see spikes in countries around the world, and then the opposition says, well, why don't you at least restrict travel from those countries, and this government doesn't act, well, then they have to be held accountable when it turns out that they should have done that much earlier. And that's our role in all of this, is to hold this government to account, to make sure that they fix the shortcomings in their response.
Let me ask you just about that, because that's what unfolded overnight and prior to that in the House of Commons. When we had you on the program last night, you said that you wanted the two things totally separate. The measures that they had in there about sort of more powers for the finance minister to respond to this, what's going on, and the financial aid package. At the end of the day, it wasn't completely separated, but there were some changes. Why were you okay with the final product?
Well, again, our preference would have been to have quickly dealt with the financial assistance. We could have done that in a couple of hours in the middle of the day, and then we could have had a longer conversation on the new tools the government was trying to write for itself. Because of our position, because of our principled stance and our refusal to sign over a blank check, we were able to get many concessions from the government in terms of more specifically defining where they could spend money, eliminating their ability to change taxes without parliamentary approval. We've built in sunset clauses so that these new measures expire in September instead of December 2021. And we've put in a mechanism that the Finance Committee can not only oversee all this new spending, but actually recall the House of Commons if we believe that there's been an abuse. So with those safeguards in place, we decided to allow the legislation to be introduced, and ultimately it passed very early this morning.
I know that that your party has advocated, along with some organizations that represent businesses, for an increase to the wage subsidy, which currently sits at 10%. The minister we just had on, the Prime Minister, all said that that is something that they're considering in the coming days. In any of your conversations, have you received any sort of timeline? And if you could put a timeline on when that should happen, that increase should happen, what should it be?
Well, there's two things we're calling for, and the timeline must be very quickly, but must be very quick, because businesses and workers who work in those businesses are experiencing this in real time. So the wage subsidy, we believe, should be raised, but we also recognize that many of these businesses just aren't even open at all. They're not paying any wages because it's, if they're a restaurant that has closed their doors, waiters and waitresses and cooks aren't getting shifts. We recognize that what's required now is that there are jobs for people to go back to when the health component of this crisis is over. That's why we've called on the government to refund the GST that they've collected from small and medium-sized businesses, so that that necessary cash injection can be made to keep those businesses afloat while they're not able to open the doors, so that people actually have a job to go back to.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thanks very much, Mr. Scheer. Appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you very much.
That's